I found the list taped behind the radiator of my new apartment on the very first night. It was written on a napkin that smelled faintly of copper. Rule number 1 was underlined 3 times. Keep the blackout curtains drawn between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. He doesn't like an audience, unless he invites one. I should have listened. Instead, I treated it like a joke. I bought a monocular to spy on the man in Unit 4B. I thought I was the one in control, the silent observer in the dark. I was wrong. I wasn't watching a show. I was auditioning for a role I never wanted to play. And now, as the handle of my front door slowly turns, I think I got the part. I'm a creature of habit. As a freelance graphic designer, my world is confined to the bezel of my dual monitors. I don't need much, just high-speed internet, strong coffee, and absolute silence. That's why the condo on 4th Street felt less like a rental listing and more like divine intervention. In a city where a studio apartment costs a kidney, finding a 1,200 square foot unit for half the market rate should have been a red flag. But desperate men don't look for flags. They look for signatures. The tour was brief. Mr. Henderson, the property manager, was a twitchy man in an ill-fitting suit. He smelled of stale tobacco and anxiety. Throughout the entire walkthrough, he checked his watch 3 times in 10 minutes, as if he had a train to catch or a bomb to defuse. He breezed past the granite countertops and the hardwood floors, rushing me toward the sliding glass door that dominated the living room wall. "This is the main feature," Henderson said, though he didn't actually look out of it. He stood with his back to the glass, eyes fixed on the hallway. "Great natural light, but you'll need to sign the privacy addendum before we proceed." That was the first oddity. The lease was standard boilerplate until page 12. There, in bold, Courier New font, was a section titled Community Visual Standards. It wasn't about noise complaints or trash disposal. It was about the windows. Clause 14B. Tenant agrees to utilize HOA-approved blackout curtains on all courtyard-facing apertures. Curtains must be fully drawn between the hours of 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. daily. Clause 14C. The use of optical enhancement devices, telescopes, binoculars, telephoto lenses, directed toward the north wing is strictly prohibited. The HOA is very particular about light pollution, Henderson muttered, tapping the paper with a sweaty finger. And privacy. The tenants in the north wing pay a premium for seclusion. We don't want any disputes. I signed it. Of course I signed it. I would have signed a blood oath for rent this cheap. I figured the neighbors were just uptight celebrities or paranoid retirees. I didn't care. I was an introvert. Keeping my blinds closed was my default setting anyway. By the afternoon, Henderson was gone, and the keys were in my pocket. I spent the day unpacking, setting up my workstation exactly how I liked it. Desk perpendicular to the wall, ergonomic chair positioned to catch the breeze from the balcony. The complex was shaped like a U, with my building running parallel to the one across the courtyard, the north wing. A concrete walkway separated us, lined with decorative, albeit dying, hedges. It was a fishbowl design. From my second-floor vantage point, I could see the sliding doors of the units opposite mine. Most were dark or covered with blinds, except for one, Unit 4B. It was directly across from me, maybe 40 feet away. Unlike the others, its curtains were wide open. The interior was dark, a gaping maw of shadow in the afternoon sun. It looked empty, devoid of furniture, devoid of life. I sat at my desk, the glow of my monitors painting the bare walls in cool blues. I felt a surge of triumph. I had a beautiful home, a quiet workspace, and money left over for takeout. I popped a beer and toasted the empty air, feeling like the king of my own little castle. I didn't know then that the castle came with a dragon, and I had just walked right into its lair. As the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the courtyard, I remembered Henderson's rule. 10 p.m. I checked my phone. It was only 7:30. Plenty of time. I decided to leave the curtains open a little longer, just to enjoy the view of the city lights flickering to life. I wanted to savor my luck. That was when I noticed the first thing out of place. In the dark void of Unit 4B across the way, a single lamp clicked on. The light in Unit 4B wasn't a warm, welcoming yellow. It was a stark, clinical white, the kind of aggressive fluorescence you'd find in an interrogation room or a hospital morgue. Through the unblocked glass, the interior of the apartment across the way looked less like a home and more like a museum display. I could see the furniture now. High-backed leather armchairs, a heavy mahogany table, and a grandfather clock that loomed in the corner like a coffin standing on end. Everything was arranged with mathematical precision, but there was no movement. Just a brightly lit stage, waiting for an actor. I turned away, feeling a prickle of unease that I couldn't quite place. I went to the kitchen to grab a beer, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. My foot kicked something loose near the baseboard heater, the radiator. It was an old cast iron unit, painted over so many times the layers looked like melting wax. Wedged behind it was a folded piece of paper, stained with something brownish red. I picked it up. It was a napkin, the cheap kind you get with takeout, but the message written on it was anything but disposable. The handwriting was frantic. The ink pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the fibers. To the new tenant of 2A. If you are reading this, I'm already gone. I didn't get my deposit back. I don't care. I just needed to leave. Management made you sign the addendum, right? They call it privacy. That's a lie. It's survival. Follow these rules if you want to stay sane. 1. The curtains must be down by 10 p.m., not 10:01, 10 sharp. 2. If you hear the glass slide open across the way, do not look. 3. If you see him standing there, do not wave. Do not make eye contact. He interprets acknowledgement as an invitation. 4. Never use a flash if you take pictures. Better yet, don't take pictures at all. 5. Pray he doesn't bring out the whiteboard. I scoffed, tossing the napkin onto the counter. The whiteboard? It sounded ridiculous. I told myself it was a prank, a classic hazing ritual for the new guy in the building. Some bored college student or a disgruntled former tenant trying to spook the replacement. I took a long sip of my beer and went back to my computer, dismissing the warning as the ramblings of a chemically imbalanced mind. Time has a way of dissolving when I'm working. I was deep into a logo design, tweaking color gradients, when the silence of the room suddenly felt heavy. The ambient noise of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic had faded away. Then I heard it. The distinct sound of a heavy sliding glass door rolling along a track. I checked the time on my monitor. 10:15 p.m. I had missed the deadline. My blinds were still open. I froze in my chair. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to just stand up and close them. It was just a neighbor getting fresh air. But the primal part of my brain, the lizard brain that evolved to fear the predator in the tall grass, told me to stay absolutely still. Slowly, involuntarily, I turned my head toward the window. Across the courtyard, Unit 4B was fully illuminated. And there he was. The tenant. He was standing right at the edge of his balcony, framed by the white light of his living room. He wore a pristine black suit, tailored to perfection, contrasting sharply with his pale skin. He wasn't looking at the moon. He wasn't looking at the street below. He was facing my building, facing my window. He stood like a statue. Not a muscle twitched. His arms were pinned to his sides, rigid and unnatural. He was so still, I wondered if he was even breathing. The distance was far enough that I couldn't make out his facial features clearly, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. It felt physical, like the pressure change before a thunderstorm. I remembered the rule: do not make eye contact. My hand hovered over my mouse. The blue light from my dual monitors illuminated my face in the dark room. I was visible. I was exposed. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was that car crash curiosity, the morbid fascination that makes you stare at something you know you shouldn't. What was he doing? Was he asleep, standing up? Then, he moved. It wasn't a human movement. It was mechanical. His head snapped to the side, then back to the center. Then he took a single step back into his apartment. He didn't turn around. He walked backward, step by agonizingly slow step, retreating into the bright white room until he was out of sight. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I scrambled up from my chair, rushed to the window, and yanked the blackout curtains shut. The room plunged into darkness. I stood there, breathing hard, feeling foolish. It was just a guy. A weird guy, sure, but just a guy. Then I heard it. A sound that traveled clearly across the quiet courtyard, penetrating the glass. Laughter. It wasn't joyful. It was dry, rhythmic, and performative. Ha, ha, ha. 3 distinct, monotone syllables. Then silence. I backed away from the window, the crumpled note on the counter suddenly looking less like a prank and more like a scripture. I checked the time again. 10:20 p.m. I had broken rule number 1 on the very first night. I didn't sleep well. I kept dreaming of a man in a black suit, walking backward through my own apartment door. Curiosity is a parasite. It burrows into the gray matter of your brain and lays eggs, hatching 1,000 questions that demand answers. After that first night, I told myself I would follow the rules. I told myself I would be the model tenant. I kept the curtains drawn. I focused on my work. But every time my eyes drifted to the clock and saw the numbers approach 10 p.m., my pulse would quicken. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, expectant. I lasted 3 days. By Thursday, the itch was unbearable. I wasn't getting any work done. My designs were sloppy. My mind was across the courtyard. I needed to know what he was doing. I convinced myself it was a security measure. If I knew his routine, I could avoid him better, right? It was a flimsy lie, but it was enough to get me to click purchase on a high-powered tactical monocular from an online surplus store. It arrived the next afternoon. It was cold and heavy in my hand, smelling of machine oil and rubber. I felt a shameful thrill as I adjusted the focus wheel. That night, I didn't close the blackout curtains. Instead, I turned off every light in my apartment. I put tape over the standby LEDs on my monitor and my router. I made my living room a black void, a perfect hideout. I pulled a dining chair up to the window, leaving a 2-inch gap between the heavy fabric of the drapes. I raised the monocular to my eye. The lens was impressive. The apartment across the way, Unit 4B, leaped forward in terrifying clarity. He was there. The lights were blazing, as always. Through the magnification, I could see details I had missed before. The suit wasn't just black, it was a deep, velvety charcoal. And his face, it was too smooth. Not in a young way, but in a processed way. His skin looked like it had been pulled too tight over his skull. He was standing in the center of the living room, staring at a painting on the wall. He stood there for 45 minutes. I timed it. He didn't blink. He didn't shift his weight. He was studying a painting of a bowl of fruit with the intensity of a bomb disposal expert. Then, the show began. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cell phone. He dialed a number slowly, pressing exaggerated precision. He held the phone to his ear. I held my breath. The monocular pressed so hard against my socket it hurt. He began to speak, or rather, he began to mime speaking. His mouth moved in erratic, jerky motions. He nodded. He shook his head. Then, his expression shifted. The blank mask crumbled into a caricature of rage. His eyes bulged, showing whites all around the irises. His jaw unhinged, opening wider than seemed anatomically possible. He was screaming. I was sure of it. He was screaming into the phone. He was playing the place of the Religions feature on this. He was working from a bids and friends. He shut the screaming, but from my vantage point, behind the double-paned safety of my window, it was a silent movie. I watched the veins in his neck bulge, the spit flying from his lips, but the courtyard remained dead silent. Suddenly, he pulled the phone away and hurled it. It smashed into a phonoblock into the last. He was too prepared through the place of pressure in the side. He believed the mooded with a potentially vase on a pedestal, sending shards of porcelain exploding in slow motion through the lens of my scope. I flinched, pulling back from the eyepiece. My heart was racing, a mixture of adrenaline and fear. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Entertainment. It was mesmerizing. It was raw, unfiltered chaos, and I had a front row seat. He stomped around the room, kicking the debris, his movements jerky and violent. Then, as quickly as it started, he stopped. He smoothed his jacket. He fixed his tie. He returned to the center of the room and resumed his statue pose, staring at the empty pedestal where the vase used to be. I lowered the monocular, sweating in my cold apartment. I felt like a god. I was the invisible observer. I knew his secrets. I knew the monster behind the suit. The rules: do not look, no optical devices. They felt trivial now. What was Henderson going to do? Evict me for bird watching? I didn't realize it then, but I wasn't the one in control. I thought I was watching a madman in a cage. I didn't understand that by looking through the lens, I wasn't just seeing him. I was connecting the circuit. I stayed up until 4 a.m. that night, watching him do nothing. I was hooked. I had become the peeping Tom, the voyeur of the macabre, and like any addict, I needed a bigger fix. By the second week, my life had simplified into 2 states: watching and waiting to watch. My freelance deadlines came and went, ignored. My inbox was a graveyard of urgent subject lines. I didn't care. The drama unfolding in Unit 4B was more compelling than any paycheck. I started noticing patterns, glitches in the performance. On Tuesday, the tenant, I started calling him the actor, spent 3 hours pacing the length of his living room. He took exactly 12 steps north, pivoted on his left heel, and took 12 steps south. He did this 200 times. I counted. The rhythm was so precise it felt generated by a script, not a biological brain. But on Wednesday, things changed. I was set up in my usual spot, lights off, monocular pressed to my eye like a second pupil. The actor was sitting on his leather couch, staring at the blank, broken screen of his TV, the one he had smashed a few nights prior. He was perfectly still. Then, a stray cat wandered onto his balcony. I recognized it. It was a calico that roamed the complex, a scruffy little thing I'd seen hunting mice near the dumpsters. Cooper, I think the neighbors called it. Cooper slipped through the railing bars and padded toward the sliding glass door. The actor's head snapped toward the glass. The movement was instant, violent, like a mousetrap snapping shut. He stood up. He didn't walk to the door. He glided to it. He slid the glass open. I wanted to yell, to bang on my window, to warn the cat. But I was frozen, a voyeur trapped by his own rules. Don't make noise. Don't be seen. Cooper froze. Sssss. The actor knelt down. I zoomed in. His face was devoid of malice. It was devoid of anything. It was a blank canvas. He reached out a hand, palm up. The cat, confused by the lack of aggression, hesitated. Then, with speed that blurred through my lens, the actor snatched the animal by the throat. I gasped, recoiling from the eyepiece. My elbow hit my coffee mug, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence of my apartment. Shatter. Splash. I scrambled to catch it, cursing under my breath. When I looked back up, without the monocular, my blood ran cold. The actor was standing at his glass door. He wasn't looking at the cat struggling in his grip. He was looking at me. Across 40 feet of darkness, through my customized blackout void, he had pinpointed the noise. He knew exactly where I was. Trembling, I raised the monocular again. I had to know. Maybe he was just looking at the building in general. I focused the lens. The actor's face filled my vision. He was smiling. It wasn't a human smile. It was too wide, stretching the skin until it looked like it might tear. It was a rictus of pure, delighted recognition. He held the struggling cat up to the glass, like a child showing off a toy. Then, he slowly raised his other hand. He was holding a piece of white poster board. He pressed it against the glass. The writing was in thick red marker. Block letters. I saw you watching. My breath hitched. He dropped the card and picked up another one from the floor. He pressed it to the glass. Do you want to see the ending? Panic, hot and primal, flooded my system. I wasn't the audience anymore. I had been discovered. The fourth wall hadn't just been broken, it had been demolished. I dropped the monocular. I scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the window until my back hit the kitchen island. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could unsee that smile. I sat there for an hour, shaking, waiting for the police to knock, waiting for him to knock. But nothing happened. The courtyard was silent. Eventually, the silence gave me false courage. I stood up, avoiding the window, and went to the front door to double-check the lock. It was engaged. The deadbolt was thrown. I was safe. Then I looked down. A faint, strobing light was coming from the gap underneath my front door. It was rhythmic. Flash, flash, flash. It wasn't coming from the hallway lights. It was coming from something sitting on my doormat. I should have walked away. I should have called 911. But the script, the damn script of this horror show, pulled me in. I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The hallway was empty. Sitting on my doormat was a black trash bag, tied shut. Poking out of a hole in the bag was the handle of a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam strobing on and off against my wall. And the smell. Copper. Iron. Meat. I knew what was in the bag before I opened it. I knew why the flashlight was strobing. It had been forced into something. Attached to the bag was a final note, written on the same red-stained napkin material as the first one. Rule number 6. If you watch the show, you pay the admission price. I didn't call the police immediately. I know how that sounds, but you have to understand. I had a bag of mutilated animal in my kitchen and a collection of illegal surveillance equipment on my desk. I looked like the suspect, not the victim. I spent the next hour scrubbing the floor with bleach until my nose burned, trying to erase the smell of copper and rot. I hid the bag in the bottom of the trash chute. I was an accomplice now. I was part of his script. When the sun came up, the terror didn't fade. It just changed texture. It went from a sharp, stabbing panic to a dull, aching dread. I called a contractor to install heavy-duty security shutters, but the earliest appointment was next week. I couldn't wait that long. I bought the thickest blackout curtains I could find, industrial grade, the kind used in photography darkrooms. I spent the afternoon on a stepladder, drilling holes into the drywall with shaking hands. Every time the drill whirred, I flinched, expecting it to cover the sound of breaking glass. I didn't look out the window. I kept my eyes on the plaster, on the screws, on anything but the apartment across the way. I sealed myself in. I used duct tape to secure the edges of the curtains to the wall, ensuring not a single photon of light could escape or enter. My living room became a tomb. I finally called the non-emergency line around 4 p.m. I reported a prowler. When the patrol car arrived, it was Officer Miller. He was young, tired, and clearly uninterested in a domestic dispute between neighbors. "He left a bag on my porch," I stammered, leading him to the door. He killed a stray cat." Miller looked at the empty doormat. "And where is the bag now, sir?" "I threw it out," I admitted. "It smelled. I panicked." Miller sighed, closing his notepad. "So, no evidence, no witnesses. Just a dispute with a neighbor you've never actually spoken to?" He looked around my apartment, his eyes lingering on the duct-taped curtains and the frantic state of my living room. "Look, buddy, cabin fever is real. Maybe take a walk, get some fresh air. If he trespasses again, call us. But we can't arrest a guy for looking at you." He left. I was alone. Night fell. Or at least, I assumed it did. Inside my bunker, time was irrelevant. I sat in the dark, clutching a baseball bat I had dug out of the closet. I told myself I was safe. I had followed the rules. The curtains were drawn. I wasn't looking. Then came the sound. It wasn't at the door. Something the put of a bend had put me luck. Rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the sliding glass door. My blood turned to ice. I live on the second floor. There is no balking on that glass. Someone would have to be hovering in mid-air or climbing the sheer face of the building like a spider. I gripped the bat tighter, my knuckles white. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched for 10 minutes, then 20. I began to think I had hallucinated it. The stress, the lack of sleep. Maybe Officer Miller was right. Maybe I was losing it. I had to know. I needed to verify reality. Slowly, agonizingly, I crept toward the window. I reached for the corner of the duct tape I had so carefully applied. I peeled it back, just an inch, just enough to put one eye to the glass. The courtyard was empty. Unit 4B was dark. I let out a shuddering breath of relief. It was in my head. Then I saw it. Attached to the outside of my sliding glass door, right at eye level, was a piece of paper. It was facing in. He hadn't been tapping to get in. He had been tapping to make sure I looked. The paper was a printout of a photo. It was a picture of me, taken from behind. It showed me standing on the stepladder earlier that day, drilling the curtains into the wall. He had been inside my apartment. Or he had taken the photo from inside his own apartment, with a lens powerful enough to see through walls? No, the angle was wrong. The photo was taken from the hallway, from inside my own home. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo in red marker were new instructions. Rule number 7. You can hide the view, but you can't hide the viewer. Open the door, Arthur. It's time for your close-up. The doorknob to my front door began to turn. The deadbolt didn't shatter. It didn't groan. It simply clicked. Smooth. Practiced. Authorized. The door swung open, and the hallway light spilled into my tomb, outlining his silhouette. The actor stepped inside. He brought the smell with him, that metallic tang of old blood and the ozone scent of a thunderstorm. He didn't attack. He didn't rush me. He walked into my apartment with the casual arrogance of a director stepping onto a set he owned. He walked right past me, ignoring the baseball bat shaking in my hands, and sat down on my sofa. He picked up the remote control from my coffee table. He pointed it at the TV, the one I hadn't turned on in weeks. Click. The screen flared to life. It wasn't cable. It was a live feed. The angle was high, looking down. It showed a man in a dark room, clutching a bat, backed against a wall covered in black fabric and duct tape. It was me. The camera was inside the smoke detector. I hadn't been watching him. I had just been watching the mirror. The whole time, I was the show. He patted the cushion next to him, a silent invitation. "The lighting was poor in the second act," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "But the climax shows promise." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the monocular. My monocular. He set it gently on the table, then pulled out something else, a knife. The same kitchen knife I had used to cut open the trash bag. He slid it across the table toward me. I looked at the door. It was open. I could run. But looking at the TV screen, I saw the hallway feed. 2 men in moving uniforms were standing just outside, waiting. "Rule number 8, the actor whispered, leaning back and crossing his legs. "The show doesn't end until the star takes a bow." I'm typing this on my phone as I walk toward the couch. He's watching me. He's smiling. If you're reading this and you see a listing for Unit 2A, don't sign the lease. The curtain is coming down.